It was the great boy George who once uttered the immortal line, "Every day is like survival." But, with all due respect to the Culture Club frontman, he probably wasn't talking about actual life and death scenarios, like landing a 14,000-foot terminal velocity freefall, treading sub-zero seawater for a night, or going the distance in a fistfight with a bear. But this video is indeed all about people for whom survival against the odds is not just a metaphor. People who faced the most extreme situations, stared death in the face, and gave it a cheeky wink. Those who, by dint of extraordinary ingenuity, determination, spirit, and, it has to be said, a colossal slice of good luck, diced with the Reaper and lived to tell the tale. So buckle up. Like, subscribe, hit the bell icon thingy, and prepare to be dazzled by the world's, nay, the universe's, most dramatic survival stories. Sucked into a storm cell. On the 14th of February 2007, Polish champion paraglider Ewa Wiśniewska had a decision to make. The World Paragliding Championships were just 10 days away, and she needed all the practice she could get. She was based near Manila, New South Wales, in Australia, where the championships were being held. And ahead of her was a final schedule of training flights to help sharpen her skills. The issue she faced on this particular day was an unfavourable weather report, with a threat of sudden storms, which she knew meant flying came with a big dollop of risk. Wiśniewska, not being faint of heart, decided to accept the odds and took off, along with around 200 other competitors who all soared into the sky. But it was a decision they regretted, as without warning, large and ominous cumulonimbus clouds began mounting up all around them, foretelling the nightmare to come. The group tried to navigate around the clouds in a desperate bid to buy time to land, but they became hopelessly trapped when two of the huge cloud stacks merged together and enveloped many of the competitors, including Wiśniewska. The storm cell she was caught up in was bone-chillingly cold, with lightning bolts firing everywhere and fist-sized hail streaking around in storm-force winds. But the worst was still to come. Her stricken craft was sucked into an ascending air current, and Wiśniewska found herself being lifted up rapidly thousands of feet into the sky. On a normal day, a paraglider might achieve a flying height of around 2,000 metres. But this was not a normal day. At one point, Wiśniewska was climbing vertically and uncontrollably at nearly 50 miles per hour, eventually reaching an altitude of nearly 10,000 metres. For reference, Mount Everest is 8,849 metres tall, and climbers call the uppermost kilometre the death zone because of the lack of oxygen, minus 50-degree temperatures, and high winds. Anyone experiencing this on a mountainside without the best possible gear and supplementary oxygen will begin to die in a matter of minutes. But remember, Wiśniewska had all this to deal with while airborne, in a hurricane and an electrical storm. She battled the lethal conditions for as long as she could, but in no time lost consciousness, her limp body at the mercy of the storm, tossed about as lightning flashed and hail impacted all around her. It was an hour later when she regained consciousness, when the worst of the storm had abated and her altitude had dropped to a mere 6,900 metres. Despite extreme frostbite, extensive blistering and hypothermia, she managed a controlled descent and landed around 40 miles from her starting location 3.5 hours earlier. Weeks later, having made a full recovery and been released from hospital, Wiśniewska said, "You can't imagine the power. You feel like nothing, like a leaf from a tree going up. I was shaking all the time. The last thing I remember, it was dark." Titanic's last survivor. On the night of the 14th of April 1912, 1,500 souls were lost to the North Atlantic Ocean when RMS Titanic was sunk after getting too friendly with a large iceberg. The event is one of the world's most famous disasters, and as such has spawned countless stories, myths, and folklore. But perhaps the most extraordinary story is the survival of the ship's chief baker, a man named Charles Johan, who legend has it survived not only the sinking itself, but also the best part of a night bobbing around in the freezing seawater. This he achieved with cool preparation and good decision-making, as well as, according to his testimony, by drinking a skinful of booze. As the Titanic started going down, Johan made no attempt to join a lifeboat, even though one had been allocated to him, and spent the time helping others and making preparations for when the ship finally sank. When the time finally came, and Titanic's bow rose into the crisp night sky, its stern already under the inky water, Johan managed to cling on at the top and rode the ship down like an elevator. At the last second, as the last metre of the mighty vessel disappeared beneath the waves, he simply stepped off it, which made him the last survivor aboard the Titanic. Then he just started paddling around. Now in modern times, we're told never to drink and swim, And one reason for that is the effect alcohol has on reducing body temperature, worsening the effect of exposure. For the record, this is sound advice, but an unusual combination of factors conspired to make Johan's experience an exception to the rule. Experts think the freezing water restricted his blood vessels, reducing the negative effects of the alcohol on his system, while allowing him to operate at an advanced level of relaxation, taking the whole thing in his stride. He was physically fit and may have used the ship's deck chairs to keep himself afloat. It is also said that his layering of clothes might have protected him from the icy water for longer. But even so, with all those explanations said, he still trod sub-zero water for 2 hours before chancing on a lifeboat. And even then, with no room on board, he had to just cling to its side. It was after another few hours during the early morning that he was properly rescued by another boat, and presumably much later still when he received any form of dry blanket or medical attention. Many of the victims of the Titanic died of cold water exposure or drowning within only a few minutes. But when he was finally seen by a doctor, this unsinkable baker was treated for nothing worse than swollen feet. Megafall. The science of falling is complex, with variables like your gender, weight, age, and what you're falling onto dictating the odds of your survival. Obviously, the height from which you fall is another important factor. On average, a 15-metre or 4-storey-ish fall has about a 50% survival rate, which drops to only 10% when the height increases to 25 metres. Increase the height to 4,400 metres then, and you have to think the odds are pretty grim, which makes the survival story of 47-year-old Joan Murray all the more extraordinary. In 1999, she was a fairly experienced skydiver, with 36 solo parachute jumps to her name. But on the occasion of her 37th jump, when she climbed through the plane's door at 14,500 feet and leapt into the blue sky, things didn't quite go to plan. Like in a bad dream, when she pulled the cord to release a parachute, nothing happened. Panicking and presumably struggling to come to terms with her imminent demise, she fell, rapidly approaching terminal velocity and, latterly, the ground, whilst frantically wrestling with her reserve chute. When, at just 700 feet from the splat moment her emergency canopy finally triggered, it did little more than send her into an uncontrolled spin. And when she finally hit the ground, Murray's poor run of luck seemed to continue, because she landed on a giant mound of fire ants, insects capable of delivering an extremely painful and occasionally lethal sting when they're under threat. Murray's shattered body received more than 200 stings, the ants presumably calculating that she hadn't suffered enough already. But it just might have been these stings that saved her life, acting as a sort of natural defibrillator and keeping her heart ticking until help arrived. Unbelievably, Murray remained conscious after the impact, and it was the pain of the ant stings, not the fall, that made her finally black out. But the stings also caused her body to produce adrenaline, probably a major factor in her survival. Fast forward 17 blood transfusions and 20 surgeries, and Murray was out of hospital for good. In fact, she recovered so well that she refused the option to retire early with disability benefits from her job at the Bank of America, and even skydived again just 2 years later. Trapped underwater. This one's a bit upsetting, so viewer caution is advised. They say that the worst things happen at sea, but below the waterline the stakes get even higher. That's why when it comes to the list of most hazardous jobs, underwater maintenance is right up there. One of the starkest examples of this was the Paraglider diving tragedy, when 5 divers went to fix a leak on an offshore oil pipeline and only one lived to tell the tale. The tragedy happened on the 25th of February 2022 in the sea off the Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. The 5 divers were a maintenance crew working on the pipe which extended from one of the islands 1,200 feet out to sea. It was used to convey oil from tankers to storage facilities on land. This was a fairly routine job for the crew, involving nothing more than changing some parts. But the men were working in an underwater pressurised air chamber at the far end of the pipe. They arrived at this chamber by swimming down several metres and then up into it. The pipe itself started with a vertical section, then it stretched out the length of 3 sprint tracks before rising up again when it hit land. To begin with, all was normal. The men were in good spirits and ready to get on with the task in hand. That was until a crew member, not realising what was about to happen, pulled a lever and released the pressure from the chamber. Instantly, air, seawater, and all 5 of the crew members were sucked down deep into the undersea oil pipe, which had a diameter of only about 30 inches. Body camera footage from one of the divers shows just how fast the event occurred. According to the testimony of the sole survivor, a man named Christopher Boudrum, all 5 came to rest in an air pocket after a long breath hold. They had been battered and suffered multiple injuries, but all were still alive. As the last man into the pipe, Boudrum agreed with the others that he was probably best placed to try and get out again. The man next to him, Faisal Kurban, elected to go too. And so, in an incalculable moment of bravery, they pushed themselves headfirst back into the water-filled pipe, holding their breath and just hoping to hit another air pocket along the way. As luck would have it, they eventually did. And even more lucky, 2 of their oxygen tanks and mask had come to rest in this section too. So in the pitch blackness, they put on their masks and carried on pushing back through the tunnel with their tanks out in front of them, not even knowing how much air was left because it was too dark to read the gauges. This was a Herculean effort, but while Boudrum was somehow able to stay focused in the pitch blackness and cold, claustrophobic, water-filled pipe, Faisal eventually became disorientated and couldn't go on. Boudrum felt like he had no choice but to continue, and he told Faisal he would send help when he reached the surface. Then he continued, retracing the entire length of the pipe back to that vertical section leading to the chamber in which the team had been working. He couldn't reach the chamber itself because the water level in the pipe was too low, but he could tread water and was also able to grab a chain that was dangling just above him. Then he just had to wait to be rescued, which thankfully eventually happened when 2 rescue divers found him. Back on the surface, despite the presence of the Coast Guard and a rescue team put together by the company that owned the oil pipe, it was deemed too dangerous to send divers down to save the remaining 4 crew members. Boudrum begged for them to change their minds, and even tried to get back into the pipe to save them himself, but he was refused and forced away. For 2 days, banging was recorded coming from the pipeline, but on the 27th of February it stopped, and the bodies of the 4 men were brought up soon after. For obvious reasons, this is a highly controversial event, and the legal investigation into both the disaster and its aftermath is ongoing. But despite the terrible outcome, Boudrum's tenacity, bravery, and utter refusal to give up makes him one of the greatest survivors of modern times. Savaged by a bear. Hugh Glass was born in Pennsylvania to Irish parents around 1783. He was a frontiersman, trapper, hunter, and fur trader. You know, an outdoorsy type. Not much is known about his early life, but at one point he was reported to have been captured by pirates and lived among them for 2 years before escaping by jumping ship in the Gulf of Mexico and swimming ashore at present-day Galveston in Texas. But that was far from his last escape. In 1823, he joined a group of 100 men ascending the Missouri River, part of a fur trading venture led by General William Henry Ashley. But soon after arriving in June 1823, the group was attacked by native Arikara warriors. Many were killed, and although he survived, Glass was badly wounded with a bullet in the leg. Having escaped, regrouped and rested, the remaining men set off from Fort Kiowa towards the Yellowstone River in present-day Perkins County, South Dakota. Scouting for game, food to keep the group going, Glass accidentally disturbed a mother grizzly bear, and, worse luck, her 2 cubs. Before Glass could react, the bear charged him, grabbed him, threw him around, slashed him with her claws, and stood on his critically injured body. By the time help had arrived, and the group had killed the bear, Glass's life was hanging by a thread. An account by another frontiersman who was present explains just how bad the wounds were.
The monster had torn the flesh from the lower part of the body, and from the lower limbs. He also had his neck shockingly torn, even to the degree that an aperture appeared to have been made into the windpipe, and his breast to exude at the side of his neck. Blood flowed freely, but fortunately his hands and arms were not disabled.
Despite having doubts whether Glass would even survive the night, his fellow mountain men carried his body on a makeshift stretcher over land for 2 days. But progress was painfully slow, and after some debate they decided to leave him behind with 2 volunteers and continue on without him. The 2 men, reportedly named Fitzgerald and Bridges, agreed to wait until Glass died and then bury him before following on. But they didn't stay for long, soon stealing anything of value from Glass's body and fleeing, catching up with the group and claiming that they'd been attacked by Arikara and that Glass was dead. But Glass was not dead, and his regaining consciousness, mutilated, bruised and abandoned in the rugged, heavily forested wilderness, was the start of perhaps history's greatest ever crawl. Having set the broken bone in his leg, and done whatever he could with the lacerations on his back that exposed part of his rib cage, Glass wrapped himself in a bear hide left behind by the others and shuffled back to the nearest settlement. The slight issue for Glass was that the nearest settlement was Fort Kiowa, roughly 200 miles away as the crow flies. It took him 6 weeks, initially navigating via prominent landmarks to the Cheyenne River, and then building a raft and free-floating to the fort. He lived off the odd root and any berries he could forage, and staved off gangrene by allowing maggots to dine out on the infected flesh of his wounds. Having inched his way to safety, presumably to the complete stupefaction of everyone, Glass went on to make a full recovery, and then turned his attention to revenge. He tracked down both Fitzgerald and Bridges, intending to kill them. But in the event, he spared them both. Bridges because he was so young, and Fitzgerald because he had joined the US Army, meaning Glass would have been summarily executed if he had killed him. Surviving a fight with a bear is one thing, but crawling 200 miles home with injuries that should cause you to die is quite another. And just as a side note, by some accounts it was Glass himself, not the rescue team, who killed the bear, making him one of only a handful of people in history to come out on top in such a one-sided encounter. But even if this, and half the other stuff, has been exaggerated or completely made up, Glass's struggle to escape the wilderness remains one of the most extraordinary feats of survival achieved by anyone, ever. That's all for now. Let me know in the comments if you've got any rival survival stories that you think are worth a mention. If you're still here, then I sincerely hope you enjoyed the video. Namaste as always. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and share if you think someone else might enjoy this kind of nonsense. And as always, thank you for watching. Leaz.